Hello, kind people. My name is Curtis Dale. I'm known mostly on the internet as Skepsis, and I'm coming at you with a mixing tutorial series in partnership with Splice. For those of you who don't know what Splice is, it's a cloud platform that lets you back up your work with unlimited free storage. I'm actually super excited to be a part of what they're doing. The site makes it really easy to collaborate with other artists all around the world. You can share full production sessions with anyone from anywhere on the planet. You can do it privately, or you can upload your files publicly. So basically you can have it so that everyone on your Splice can see what you're doing, or you can make it so only who you want to can see it, which is really, really cool. I'm really glad that they added that in there. I'm going to actually be doing that with this tutorial series. You're going to be able to download this project file and work along with me as we work through the process of mixing. So if you want, you can follow the link below to download Splice and the project file from this video, and then you can follow along and do exactly what I do. But before I get down into the actual mixing practices, I just want to talk a bit about mixing and what it encompasses. Mixing is more than just finding the right volume levels between your tracks. It's carving each layer of your sound into puzzle pieces and then trying to fit them together into one solid piece of art. Mixing is a science as much as it is an art. First things first, the most important tool in mixing, next to the volume fader of course, is the EQ. In Logic we have several different kinds of EQs. There's a channel EQ, a linear phase EQ, a match EQ, and a single band EQ. Each of these has its own place and purpose, but we'll primarily be using the linear EQ. In Logic, when you open either a channel EQ or a linear EQ, you'll see that they look exactly the same. Yours might look differently than mine because I haven't updated my Logic yet. So what is the difference between the two? I'm going to tell you. The linear EQ is much more precise than the regular EQ, and because of that, it has no smearing. What that means is there's no phase shift between the different frequency bands. Are you going to hear a difference in quality between the two EQs? No, probably not. Not on the individual tracks, but on the finished product, you just might. So it's probably a good idea to use the linear EQ whenever possible. So a couple seconds ago I made a really kind of bad reference to a puzzle and everything being kind of like a puzzle, but that really is what it is. I made a visual right here of the frequencies in our song are the leads, the chords, the bass, the drums, the atmosphere, and they all fit together inside of the one frequency range. But the problem is that when the main lead takes up half of the entire frequency range, how are you supposed to fit them together? Well, the answer is always subtractive EQing. Here's another cheesy visual for you. Imagine two boxes made of diamond and rock set to fill in an empty space of one box. How do you make it fit? You cut out the stuff you don't need from each box, the rock, and you simply put what's left together, and what that is just one solid box of diamond. That's your finished track. The key is you have to put the most important part of each box, or in music, the sound, into its place. It only becomes difficult when you're stuck trying to decide how much of the sound to cut away and what parts you want to keep. So let's get to it. We're going to subtractive EQ each individual track of this song, or at least the ones that need it. We want to make our EQ cuts while all or most of the sounds are playing so that we know how they'll sound all together. It doesn't really matter how they sound separately unless you have an instrument playing a solo part in the song. We'll start our cutting with kind of our mixing rules of thumb, which are that other than on sub bass, we can cut out everything under 100 hertz at least. So I'm literally going to go through every track, go to linear phase EQ, and just start by cutting out everything under 100 hertz. So I've skipped ahead, and what I've done is I've literally cut out everything under 100 hertz on every instrument except for a few. Here we have this special pad, and at this part of the song, it's playing with just this simple little guitar pluck. So I had absolutely no need to cut under 100 hertz. I thought it sounded better with it left in. But here, the pad is playing with all of these other instruments. So I did cut under 100 hertz. The other things I didn't cut are obviously the sub bass. And if you have headphones on, you'll definitely be able to hear that. And a kick drum. And that's our first subtractive EQing rule of thumb. Second is that any frequencies in tracks layered over top of the kick and the snare should be lowered around 200 and 300 hertz so that the kick and the snare stand out more. So we can see that in this section there's lots of overlapping track information. I'm going to go through and lower the gain around 200 to 300 hertz. That will do nicely. Next rule of thumb is that when lots of instruments are layered over top of each other like this, the frequencies between 500 and 1000 tend to build up because that's probably the strongest range in most of the sounds you're going to have in your track. So we can go through and just take out a little bit of information right between 500 and 1000, probably just like that. Now if we play this song, we'll find that our mid-range is really, really clean. We have a lot of really harsh frequencies up above 5,000 to 6,000 hertz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on mid-range sounds and cut out frequencies above, I don't know, around 10,000 hertz. It's already sounding a lot better than it did before. There's much less frequency crashing. Now that we're done with the rule of thumb surgical cuts, we're going to do our specific typical mixing cuts. So these are ones that fit specific instruments in almost every track we work on. The first and most common one is cutting underneath of 120 hertz out of our snare. This track actually doesn't have a snare, but if it did, I would cut under 120 hertz or around there, making sure that I kept fundamental. The fundamental being the largest peak in the sample. The next specific typical cut is going to be our kick drum. Again, we'll be using a linear phase EQ to cut out frequencies below 30 hertz, just to clean up our low end a little bit. After that is the hi-hats. A lot of hi-hat samples create way too much mud in the low end, so we're going to bring up our cut we did earlier to around 220 hertz. That will be perfect. Now in our sub bass, we're going to do the exact same thing we did to our kick drum. We're going to throw on a linear EQ. We're going to cut underneath of 30 hertz to get rid of mud. And we're actually also going to cut above 200 hertz because we don't need anything above there for a sub bass. And because I've bit crushed the sub bass to give it some character, it is creating frequencies up above 200 hertz. Now we have a nice thick fat sub bass, and it's not muddying up our frequency range at all. Now once you've done this, and before you start hacking away your instruments trying to make them fit together like Lego bricks, you need to remember that even in a section of an EQ they look completely filled up by a synth melody, it is likely that around half of the frequencies you see are actually being taken up. I mean, just look at them, they're like spiky and mountainy looking. There's tons of space in between each frequency band that's not being taken up. This means there's room to layer sounds within the same frequency range, but there is, however, a line between too many and not enough. Surgical EQ cutting can help you to get a really full-sounding mix, and it can make that full-sounding mix loud, but it can also make it sound too thin, so you need to be careful when you're doing this. If you've cut your song, and you're listening to it, and you find it sounds thin, the best thing to do is start over. I mean on the mixing process, not on the song, of course. Anyways, this has been Learning with Splice, Mixing in Logic, Episode 1. I'm your host, Skepsis, and I'll see you guys in the next one.